So what were some of the findings from the Vera study of the offices across the country? I understand it was Manhattan and Milwaukee were some of the central offices of that project. Professor Harrison Wayne, can you talk a little bit about that and what some of the findings were?
So the three initial offices were Mecklenburg County, which is Charlotte, North Carolina, San Diego, here in California, and Milwaukee. Each of those offices had varying data capacities. And so even though when we started in Charlotte, they basically had no data capacity. And while at Vera, we had to literally develop a system that they can use in their drug division just to collect data. And while they needed a big industrial shop vac, we gave them a little dust buster just for the sake of the project. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin had developed a case management system for prosecutors all over the state. But for some reason, even though Milwaukee was their most active county, they didn't give it to Milwaukee. And so much of my time, even up to the point of lobbying the governor, was spent around trying to get Milwaukee what they call the Protect system, and basically making the argument, look, whatever designs and implementation changes that we did for Milwaukee would be available to the entire state. So that was a huge benefit. San Diego, I guess they're a rich county, because their office had one of the best case management systems I've seen around the country. I want to go back to Milwaukee when you're talking about what does the data show, and because I started talking about those two specific areas where you saw bias. When we looked at their narcotics and tried to figure out where the problem was, their biggest issues were in cases where they were charging the first-time possession of marijuana, first-time possession of cocaine, and possession of drug paraphernalia. Looking at the drug paraphernalia example, if you were arrested for possession of drug paraphernalia and you were white, your chances of being prosecuted was only around 27%. If you were black, it was over 42%. So that was a clear disparity. When we showed it to the managers and asked, and once again, this is all about getting prosecutors to look at this and them being part of what's going on instead of people from the outside pointing fingers. Two really interesting things came up. Number one, they realized that the concentration of African Americans was in the city of Milwaukee, not the county. And so when we looked at the character of the drug paraphernalia, more often than not, was a crack pipe. Whereas outside the city, in the county, where you had a lot of whites, the character of the drug paraphernalia, it varied. And when you're talking about implicit bias, the fact that this was a crack pipe immediately conjured up images of more serious criminal conduct. It didn't take long for someone in the office, a senior manager, to say, well, wait a minute. Look how many of these cases we're processing. Why are we doing this? This is evidence of a drug problem, not necessarily a crime. We're wasting our resources. Who's making these decisions? This is where being a manager in a DA's office helped, right? Because my research team had already looked at it. And we showed it was the youngest prosecutors in the office who were making these types of decisions. And so the DA did two things. Number one, immediately changed the policy to drug paraphernalia, default, diversion. If there was something with that specific case where it needed to be charged, then you had to get a supervisor to approve it. The second thing was mixing senior prosecutors in with the junior prosecutors to make decisions at the time of the case where prosecutors, we have the least amount of information. and that's at the moment you're charging. How does this work? Again, you could probably predict within another 6 to 7 months, that disparity had disappeared. The only way they knew how to address it was by identifying it. You know, if you can't count it, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yeah, I won't add much to that. You get the picture. The important thing there is that if you have the data and you can identify the problem, you can identify a solution and then make that reality. That is the opposite of what I said a minute ago when people without data who are running offices say, well, we don't have a problem. All of our people are good. This sort of thing that Wayne's data allowed these prosecutors to do, to fix it, also allows them, those prosecutors, to go to the community and say, look, we're aware that this problem is out there. We've examined ourselves, and this is what we did. We're not here saying we don't have problems. We're here saying we might, and when we do, we will fix it. And that has resulted, I'm sure, for at least the current prosecutor in Milwaukee, who is now the first assistant to Mr. McCann when Wayne started the project, John Chisholm, who's now the DA there now, he's been able to go to his community and say, look, we found this, here's what we did. We're constantly looking for issues like this, and it has garnered some important community support.
And you know what, I actually forgot one, because I want to show a flip side. Remember I said about those 6 crimes where you were less likely to be prosecuted if you were black? One of the areas was an area of property crimes. And when I asked them what they were thinking about, what they thought was going on there, someone said, well, we're self-correcting because the quality of those crimes and those prosecutions are really poor. And so obviously we're making the right decisions about not charging it. Another manager who happened to head up the community prosecutions unit said, well, wait a minute. Maybe what we're doing is devaluing the victim. Because of who they are, they don't trust the police, so they're not complaining as much. They've got a harder time taking time off to come to the office to follow up on their cases, whereas if a car gets vandalized outside of the city of Milwaukee, you've got someone acting like it's the crime of the century. And I sat back and watched them actually talk about this. And so someone else said, well, if we fix that problem, won't we then start prosecuting more African Americans? And the comment was, well, if the only tool in your kit is a hammer, right, then every problem looks like a nail. If you identify those problems, why can't you then go to the community and figure out how you can work with the community to stop those types of crimes from taking place in the first part? I mean, we're all about public safety. The greatest part of public safety is the crime that's never committed.
Great. So we touched on community involvement, which is very critical, but I want to turn to DA Gascón with regards to the hiring and selection of prosecutors and then the eventual training of them. How does is there a way to weed out implicit bias at the hiring stage? And once you have prosecutors in your office, what can we do to ensure that they are cognizant of their implicit bias and make sure that cases aren't being affected by implicit bias?
Right. You know, again, starting from the premise that we all have implicit biases, regardless of race, I think that there are ways to mitigate the impact in our work. So certainly one of the things that we have done in my office is we have been very aggressive about ensuring that we hire people that reflect the community that we serve. So recently, earlier this year, for instance, Stanford University did an analysis of the racial and gender makeup of prosecuting offices in California. There are 58 counties. And we actually rated, of the large counties, we rated as the best. And part of that is because we have made it a very strong effort, very conscious effort to ensure that we reflect that. And I believe that that does translate into a different level of sensitivity, not only in the way that we prosecute cases, but quite frankly in the water cooler talk, right? So we actually have the highest percentage of Asian Americans of any office in the state, and of course that reflects our community. We have the second highest percentage of African American, the third highest percentage of Hispanic or Latinos, and we have the highest percentage of women. We're 53% women in our office overall, and then in the management side of it, actually we are even higher than that. So I think that that begins to have an impact on the way that we do our work and the way that we look at our community. The other things that we do is we started a neighborhood prosecutor program. We have prosecutors that are assigned to police stations and neighborhoods, and they're constantly, they actually work very little work in the Hall of Justice. Most of their time is actually working with community groups, working with the police, and trying to educate people as to the role that we play, and for us to, you know, have a direct line of communication to communities that, quite frankly, traditionally would not be coming to us. We did the same thing with our victim services. So we have victim services hours, and we have actually people deployed in communities, especially communities that are most impacted by violence and by crime. And again, working with people, educating them about the system, providing assistance, even when people are not necessarily directly involved in the criminal justice system. As I indicated earlier, we're in the process now of coming to the final phase of a study that will give us the data that we hope will give us a better understanding of, you know, what impact does race play in our work. And I say what impact because I fully expect that we're going to see an impact, and it's going to be a disparate impact. We know that when we look at, you know, sort of raw numbers. But what we're trying to do with the study is get to the next level, sort of start peeling the onion and doing what Wayne and Professor Harris talked about earlier, is getting to the level of granularity, you know, the granular level where we can start taking action to start reducing the impact. So basically, it's three ways. You know, it's in our recruitment and hiring process, which also talks about the way that we train our people and then we promote our people. It's in our involvement in the community, which we take very seriously, and we're very aggressive about that involvement. And then finally, it's going to be in developing a good understanding of data so that then we can start taking some corrective measures to reduce the impact of implicit bias in our work.
And Wayne, Professor Harris, anything else to add with regards to the hiring process, and also what role diversity plays? Because now we've stated that everyone pretty much has a bias, right? So does that mean diversity isn't important in prosecution, or, you know, or can African American prosecutors be even more harsh on their own than a non-African American prosecutor?
David is looking at me, so in response to that question, yes, I have experienced African American prosecutors who are more harsh than their colleagues on African American defendants, because I guess there's this fear that I don't want to look like I'm giving preferential treatment. So, number one, that does exist. And again, I'll emphasize what David mentioned. Even when you take the implicit association test, right, there is a high number of African Americans who show a slight to moderate preference for white males. It's there. You can then have other things that are going on that can contribute to that. In Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, there was a prosecutor who handled most of the office's capital cases. And at one point, he was solely responsible for a little over 50% of the individuals on death row in Pennsylvania. And his nickname was the Widowmaker. And so you had folks who had a real issue with him. But having had conversations with him, part of his motivations were he felt, number one, he clearly believed in capital punishment, but he also felt that the life of a black man, no matter who that individual is worth and equal to the life of anyone else. So when you take the life of an African American man, doesn't matter who's behind, the gun or who pulls the trigger, he had no problems with capital punishment. And so you had that effect. Clearly, how your office looks, however, after everything I've just said, is extremely important. And it's not just in your hiring practices, it's not just in your retention practices, but it's also in your promotion practices. Having been a manager in an office where at the management level we were extremely diverse, I know firsthand it makes a difference. I know firsthand when I'm making decisions and personnel decisions about assistants that I've supervised that it makes a clear difference. I know that it makes a difference when if you're LGBTQ and you see a manager, it gives you hope that that can be you. If it's a woman, it gives you hope that that can be you. If you're an African American male or female, it gives you hope that that can be you as well. And so it is clear, and I can't emphasize enough how not just your hiring, but what your management level looks like matters.
I'll just answer the harsher question very quickly. Yes, I believe that is a real phenomenon, and I take also my experience working with police departments where the very same thing would sometimes rear its head. You would have people who, officers, African-American officers who were more feared in the African-American community than the white officers for the same reasons we're talking about. And as to the question about whether diversity within the office matters, I would say in a very important way that we really haven't talked so far, and I'm sure we'll get to it, about what we can do about the problem of implicit bias. But one of the things that I would always raise is exposure. The evidence is clear that when people are exposed to positive models from the minority community, when they know more minority individuals on a personal and professional basis, the implicit biases don't go away, but their effect is greatly blunted because your conscious bias, your conscious beliefs in egalitarianism and your beliefs and knowledge of the individual person serves to overcome what the implicit biases might be doing to your behavior. So it's a very good thing from that point of view alone. There are others too.